The Secret of the Old Mill. Chapter 3. The Hardy Boys at School. If the boys had any lingering hopes that their school chums would not hear of the manner in which they had been fooled, these hopes were quickly removed next morning. Scarcely had Frank and Joe ascended the concrete steps of Bayport High than Chet Morton, their closest friend, a lad with a passion for practical jokes, came solemnly toward them with some fake money in his hand. "Just the fellows I'm looking for," he chirped. "My great-grandmother just died in Abyssinia, and I'm trying to raise a railway fare to go to her funeral. How about changing this 100?" There was a roar of laughter from about a dozen boys who were standing about, for Chet had evidently acquainted them all with the affairs of the previous day. How he had learned of it, Frank and Joe could not imagine. They grinned good-naturedly, although Joe blushed furiously. "What's the matter?" asked Chet innocently. "Can't you change it? You don't mean to tell me that you can't change my $100 bill? Please, kind young gentleman, please change my bill. For if you don't, I'm sure nobody else will, and then I won't be able to go to my great-grandmother's funeral in Abyssinia." He wiped away an imaginary tear. "Sorry," said Frank gravely. "We're not in the money-changing business." "You mean you're not in it any more," pointed out Chet. "You were in the business yesterday, I know." "What's the matter? Retire?" "Yes, we quit." "I don't blame you." Suddenly Chet struck an attitude of exaggerated surprise. "Why, bless my soul, I do believe this bill is bad." He peered at the flimsy piece of money, and then whipped out a small magnifying glass from his pocket and squinted through it. At last he raised his head with a sigh. "Yes, sir, it's bad. It's counterfeit. One of the cleverest counterfeits I've ever seen. If it hadn't been for the fact that there is no $100 bill mark on it, and that the picture of a president is actually of the Monopoly man instead of George Washington, I'd have been completely fooled. Isn't it lucky that you boys didn't change it for me? Isn't it lucky? Congratulations. Young sirs, congratulations." He shook Frank and Joe warmly by the hand, and in the meantime keeping a very solemn face, while the others lads surged about in a laughing group and joined in the kidding. They jested unmercifully about the incident of the counterfeit $5, but the Hardy boys took it all in good part. The news had leaked out through Mr. Mose, who had told Jerry Gilroy, one of the Hardy boys' chums, about the affair just a short while after they had left the store the previous afternoon. Jerry had lost no time in acquainting Chet and the others with the details. "If you keep on changing money for strangers, you won't have much left out of those rewards," declared Phil Cohen, a diminutive boy and one of their friends. He was referring to the money the Hardy boys had received in rewards for their work in the Tower Mansion case and for helping run down the smugglers. "Oh, I guess we still have a few dollars," replied Frank, smiling. "We have enough in the bank to buy a motorboat with anyway." "What's that?" asked Chet quickly. "Are you getting a motorboat?" The Hardy boys nodded. Their chums were immediately interested. "Put me down for one of the first passengers," shouted Biff Hooper, a tall, broad-shouldered boy who had just pushed his way through the circle. "We're thinking of getting one like Tony Prideaux's," said Joe. "I wish it was mine," exclaimed Tony. His father, one of the most respected citizens in the Italian colony of Bayport, owned a speedy motorboat, which had proved a great service to the Hardy boys in their conflict with the smugglers of Barmont Bay. "Dad told us last night we could get one as long as we stayed in the bay and along the coast with it. He was afraid we might get ambitious and try crossing the Atlantic." "Well," remarked Jerry Gilroy, "I see where our summer baseball league is shot to pieces now." "Why?" "You'll be out in that boat every minute of your spare time." It was bad enough when you had the motorcycles. You were both always roaming around the country on them, but now we'll never be able to find you at all. There goes the best pitcher and shortstop on our team." Jerry looked very glum as he said this, for he was an ardent ball fan and he had been much in the forefront of organizing a league for the summer months. Frank Hardy was one of the best pitchers in the school, and Joe could cover short in a manner that was the envy of his companions. But in spite of their natural ability for the game, the Hardy boys had always shown a preference for outings instead of baseball. "I'd rather go out for a whole day on a motorcycle or in a motorboat than play a dozen ball games," said Frank. This was rank heresy to Jerry, who could not bear any reflections on his beloved game. "Gosh, I don't know what's to become of you two. Can I count on you for any games at all?" "Sure you can," promised Frank. "We're not going to live in the motorboat. If you go fooling around Bearmont Reefs on a stormy day in that old tub, you'll die in it, though," snickered Chet. "That'll be about enough from you," warned Frank, giving him a friendly dig in the ribs. Then, turning to Jerry, he went on. "We'll play on your team, but we won't spend all our time outside of meal hours in practicing. Well, I suppose I should be satisfied. We can't have everything, but I'd imagine you'd like to practice." "They don't need to," declared Chet. "That's why you have to spend all your spare time learning how to catch. Even now, you're not much good at it." He winked at Tony Prideaux, who was standing behind Jerry. "While I'll bet you can't catch a measly little fly like this. Look." He took a baseball out of his pocket and threw it lightly into the air. It did not go very high. It was a ridiculously easy catch for anyone. As for Jerry Gilroy, who was really a star outfielder, it was scarcely worth the effort. He had but to step back a pace, and the ball was his. "Can't I?" he said, somewhat nettled by Chet's words. The ball arched through the air and descended directly towards him. He stepped back, prepared to make the easy catch. But Tony Prideaux had caught Chet's wink and knew what it meant, for they had carefully rehearsed the trick between them. As soon as Chet had thrown the ball, Tony knelt on his hands and knees on the grass immediately behind Jerry. For all his seeming carelessness, Chet had thrown the ball just far enough so that Jerry would have to step back to make the catch. Jerry collided with the recumbent figure behind him. He staggered, lost his balance, and tumbled over Tony, while the baseball thumped into the grass. The other boys, who had seen the joke from the start, laughed uproariously as Jerry picked himself up and betook himself in pursuit of the already fleeing Tony, while Chet, with an air of vast satisfaction, picked up the baseball. "I knew he couldn't catch it," he said, with all the airy disdain of a minor prophet. Just then the gong in the main hall of Bayport High School began, summoning the students in their classes, and the boys crowded through the wide doorway. Chapter 4. Another Victim. When he took his place in class that morning, Frank Hardy glanced over at the desk 2 aisles away, where Callie Shaw was sitting. Callie was a brown-haired, brown-eyed miss, with a quick, vivacious manner. But Callie was plainly worried and downcast. She seldom raised her eyes from her books. She answered the teacher's questions in a most abstracted manner, and altogether it appeared that there was something on her mind beyond schoolwork. When recess came, she walked slowly out of the room, not mingling with the other girls. Frank saw her go outside towards the campus, where she sat down on the grass by herself, watching an impromptu basketball game and declining all requests to join in the fun. He went over to her and flung himself down on the grass. "What's the matter, Callie?" She looked up at him and smiled faintly. "Oh, hello, Frank. Where did you drop from?" "I've been sitting right across from you in school all morning, and this is the first time you've noticed that I'm alive." "Oh, sorry, Frank. I didn't mean to be rude. I've got something on my mind this morning, that's all." Trouble? She nodded. What about? Money. He was puzzled by this remark. Callie lived with her cousin, Miss Polly Shaw, the proprietor of a beauty parlor in the city, and although Miss Shaw was not rich, she made a comfortable living. Therefore, when Frank heard Callie say that she was worried about money, he was naturally puzzled. Callie's parents lived in the country, but they sent their daughter frequent remittances to pay the expenses of her education in Bayport. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Didn't your allowance come?" "No, it isn't that. I'm all right. It's Polly. She lost some money. More than she could afford." "Lost some? How was that?" "She lost $50 last night." Frank whistled. "Whew, that's a lot of money." "It certainly is. The worst of it is that Polly had just made the final payment to some new electrical fixtures in the shop, and it had left her pretty short of cash. I feel bad about it for her sake." "How did it happen?" "A woman came into the store last night and brought some beauty preparations, quite a large order. It amounted to about $12, and she had nothing less than a $50 bill in her purse. Polly had that much money in the till, for it was near the end of the day, and she didn't like to lose the order, so she changed the bill." Frank nodded soberly. He knew now what had happened. "And the money was counterfeit," he said. "Why, how did you know?" exclaimed Callie. "I was fooled yesterday myself." Frank then went on to tell Callie how he and Joe had been victimized by the stranger on the station platform. "Dad says there's a lot of this counterfeit money being circulated," he said. "They certainly aren't losing much time in getting rid of it around Bayport. Gee, first a 5 and now a 50? I'm sure sorry that Polly is out of that much money." "Yes, it's a big amount," declared Callie. "Of course she'll get along, but no one likes to lose that much." "Did she know the woman?" "Oh, no. She was a total stranger. She was rather handsome and was well dressed. Polly didn't suspect anything wrong. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until she picked up the paper after work last night and read that the banks had issued a warning about counterfeit money that she began to think about it. So she called up Mr. Wilkins, who works in one of the banks, and he came over and took a look at the bill. He said right away that it was no good, although he admitted it was so cleverly done that anyone might be fooled by it. Just what they said about my 5. Did Polly tell the police?" "I suppose she has told them by now, but she gave me the bill and asked me to turn it over to your father." "Good. Dad happens to be working along those lines just now. Have you got the bill with you now?" "It's in my purse in the cloakroom. I'll let you have it at lunch hour." So when school was dismissed, at noon, Callie gave Frank the counterfeit $50 bill. Frank examined it closely, like the $5 bill he and Joe had changed for the plausible stranger the previous day. It was crisp and new. Frank had seen very few $50 bills in his life, either genuine or otherwise, but he realized that this specimen was a very good imitation. The mere fact that such bills are not often seen by the average person no doubt rendered it easier to pass without being readily detected. "I'll show this to my father," he promised Callie. "I'm afraid it won't do much good. Polly will have to stand her loss unless she can trace the woman who passed the bad bill on her. But perhaps this will help Dad find the source of all this counterfeit money. Goodness knows how many poor people are being victimized just as Polly was," said the girl. "I hope they catch the people who are at the bottom of it all." When Joe joined Frank on the school steps, Frank told him about the incident at the beauty parlor and of how Polly Shaw had lost $50 in goods and money to the strange woman. "Of course," said Frank, She may have been perfectly innocent in passing that $50 bill. Perhaps she didn't realize it was counterfeit. But I'm beginning to think this gang has a number of people traveling around getting rid of the imitation bills. Once they get them into circulation, they'll go from hand to hand. Somebody is bound to lose in the end, and usually it's the honest person who finds out that the money is bad and won't pass it any further. The crooked ones will just try to get rid of it as quickly as they can. When they reached home, Frank told his father about Polly Shaw and handed over the counterfeit bill. "So they're dealing in 50s now," he exclaimed Fenton Hardy as he looked at the money. "Do you think it's made by the people who turned out that bad 5 that we got stung on?" Joe asked. Mr. Hardy drew a magnifying glass from his vest pocket and made a close scrutiny of the bill. "It seems to have been printed on the same press, but I'm not sure," he announced at last. "These things are so cleverly done, it would take an expert to notice any differences." He proceeded then to examine the $5 bill, comparing it closely with the 50, and at last he put the glass back into his pocket. "I'm practically certain that these bills were issued from the same press. The paper seems to be of the same kind, just a shade lighter than the paper used in the genuine money, and there are certain little differences in the engraving that are almost identical on each bill. Miss Shaw won't mind if I keep this, will she?" he asked Frank. "She asked me to give it to you. I'll send both these bills to an expert in the city, and we'll get his opinion on it." Mrs. Hardy, a pretty, fair-haired woman, sighed. "I'm sure I don't know what this world's coming to," she said, "when men will make bad money and know that poor people are going to lose by it. It's a shame." "There's nothing some of them won't stop at when it comes to filling their own pockets," declared her husband. "But perhaps when the expert sends me his report on this bill, I'll have something more to work on. If it turns out that there is one central gang circulating this money, we'll all have to be on the lookout." Chapter 5. Currying the Joker. Hard work in school occupied the attention of the boys for the rest of the week, for examination time was near, and even Jerry Gilroy was obliged to dismiss baseball from his mind in a frantic attempt to catch up with his geometry and Latin. That somehow appeared to keep perpetually ahead of him. Frank and Joe sweated out the ablative absolute and grumbled over the heroic exploits that could be resurrected from the deathless lines of Caesar and Virgil if one could but distinguish verbs from nouns, and wondered, as schoolboys have wondered from time immemorial, why they should be obliged to concern themselves with things that happened 2,000 years ago, and more when they might better be outside playing. When Friday night came, they emerged from the haze of declensions and vocabularies, axioms and theorems, equations and symbols, in which they had been engulfed all week, and decided that Saturday should see them as far away from school as possible. "Let's get out of the city altogether," suggested Frank, as the Hardy boys left the classroom on Friday afternoon. "What say we all go for a hike out in the country?" "Suits me," agreed Chet. "No motorcycles either. Let's walk." "Good idea," Jerry approved. "Unless," he said hopefully, "you fellows would rather come up to campus and have baseball practice." "Another smart remark like that one out of you, and I'll practice my famous left hook on your jaw," warned Biff, squaring off in a attitude of the boxer. "We don't want to see or hear of this school again until Monday morning, and that'll be too soon." All right," said Jerry placatingly. "I just thought I'd mention it." "And I just think you'll forget about it," said Chet. "You'll come along on this hike with us. Here, have an apple and keep quiet." He dug into the inexhaustible recesses of his pockets and produced a slightly shop-worn apple, which he thrust into Jerry's hands. "There, see if that'll keep you quiet for a while." Jerry, who could never resist anything in the nature of food, accepted the donation eagerly. "Where shall we go on this hike?" he asked, raising the fruit to his lips. "I was thinking we could go up to Carl Summers' farm," suggested Joe. Mother was saying she wondered if Summers would let her have any cherries this year. This would be a good time to ask him. "Suits me," said Jerry, taking a prodigious bite of the apple. Then an expression of pained surprise crossed his face, to be replaced by a look of ghastly realization. Tears spurted to his eyes, and his jaws worked convulsively. Then he emitted a gurgle of agony, spluttering, spat out the apple, and began to dance around on the pavement, waving his arms in the air. Chet gravely clapping his hands. "A fine dance, my boy, a fine dance." "Pepper," splurted Jerry. "I'm burning up. Water." "Call the fire brigade," advised Chet, bursting into a shriek of laughter. The other lads gazed at their companion in amazement, while his wild antics became too much for them, and they all roared as Jerry continued his frantic spluttering. Wildly, the victim turned towards the school again. There was a water fountain near the front door, and he headed towards it. But his eyes were so full of tears from the mouthful of red pepper that he had gulped when he bit into the hollow apple, that he did not see a flower bed in his path. Jerry stumbled over the wire border and sprawled full length among the flowers. The janitor, a cantankerous individual named McBain, had been standing nearby watching the performance with a broad grin on his usually dour features. But when he saw Jerry fall into his precious flower bed, he gave a roar of fury. "Ah, will ya?" he bewailed. "Ah, frae me flowers, ye young limb. I'll hae ya reported." McBain always lapsed into broad Scotch when his temper was aroused. The rest of the boys scattered, fearing the wrath to come. Jerry managed to scramble out of the flower bed just as the janitor reached him. He jumped out of reach of the outstretched hand, with the result that McBain lost his balance and overstepped the border, treading on some choice blossoms and getting tangled up in the wire. Jerry made for the fountain and was already taking deep gulps of cool water when McBain, now spluttering unintelligible phrases that could only have been understood in remotest reaches of Caledonia, got out of the flower bed and thundered towards him. With a longing glance at the sputtering water, for his raging thirst was not yet appeased, and with a fearful glance at the approaching janitor, Jerry turned and fled. He joined his laughing companions at the street corner, and with a shamefaced air admitted that the joke had been on him. McBain gave up the chase, vowing threats of vengeance on the following Monday. "He'll forget all about it by then," assured Phil. "I won't forget about it," declared Jerry. "Next time anybody offers me an apple, I'll ask for an orange instead." "You can't very well fill that with pepper." "I'll get even with you, Chet." "You're welcome to try," replied the practical joker cheerfully. "But in the meantime, let's plan this trip for tomorrow." As a result of their arrangements, the Hardy boys and their chums met in the barn back of the Hardy home early the next morning, all outfitted for a hike into the country. Each lad carried a substantial lunch, their mothers realizing that the noonday meal by the roadside is one of the chief features of such an outing. Phil and Tony were late, and the other boys put in the time by exercising in the Hardy boys' well-equipped gymnasium, to which purpose the barn had been converted. Biff practiced left hooks and uppercuts with desperate intensity and battered the punching bag until it hummed. Chet almost broke his neck attempting some complicated maneuvers on the parallel bars that were meant as an imitation of a circus bareback rider. Jerry contemplated his lunch and wondered if it were too soon after breakfast for a piece of pie. Phil and Tony arrived together, and the boys started off at last, trudging along the broad highway in the early morning sunlight, whistling away in the best of spirits. They were decorous enough while they were in the city limits, but once they struck the dusty country roads, their natural activity asserted itself, and they wrestled and tripped one another, ran in races, and picked berries by the roadside, and laughed, shouted, without a care in the world. The road skirted the Willow River, which ran along the farms and the hills back of Bayport, through a pleasant pastoral country. Towards the middle of the morning, the boys left the road and struck out beneath the trees towards the secluded spot on the river, where they enjoyed a swim. For over an hour they splashed about in the cool water. Chet was the first to come ashore, and the others would have remained much longer had it not been for the discovery that their thoughtful companion, after getting dressed, was busying himself in the time-honored pastime of tying their clothes into knots. Whereupon they scrambled out of the water and chased the chubby one into the shelter of some bushes, whence they were unable to pursue him any further because the thorns hurt their bare feet, and they were forced to retreat, hopping towards the river bank while Chet jeered at them from the covert. "Chaw on the beef," he cried in time-honored way. "Just you wait," spluttered Joe, chewing on a knot with all his might. "Am waiting," was the cheerful retort of the joker. "We'll skin you alive," muttered Jerry. "And salt you," said Frank. But when they had untied the knots, they gave chase, and the plump jester was soon winded, although he had a good start. He puffed and panted as they chased him down the road in the dust. They caught up to him at the entrance of the lane leading into Carl Summers' farm, forcibly divesting him of his hiking boots, socks, necktie, and proceeding to wreak havoc. "We'll cure you of your practical jokes for a while," promised Frank with a grin, as he cast one boot into a field wherein a bad-natured bull was grazing, and the other into a field at the other side of the lane with a heavy growth of thistles round the fence. "See if you're as good at untying knots as you are at tying them," said Jerry, as he twisted Chet's necktie into a veritable Chinese puzzle. "Now see how it feels to walk round in your bare feet," suggested Phil, as he hung one of Chet's socks over the limb of a tree some distance down the road, and placed the other in the middle of a clump of brambles. Biff Hooper and Tony then released the protesting Chet. They had been sitting on him in the middle of the lane while the others were performing their kindly offices. "We'll see you down at the farm," said Biff airily, as the lads were chuckling down the lane in the direction of Summers' place. Spluttering and vowing threats, Chet was forced to retrieve his clothes. When he sought to regain his boot from the pasture, the bull saw him and rushed towards him with a bellow. Chet, in bare feet, just reached the fence in time and tumbled over into the bushes with the rescued boot. Then he had to step gingerly through the thistle patch in the other field before he could get the other boot. After that, he had to climb a tree before he could reach one sock, and go plunging through the brambles before he could regain the other. When the laughing boys last saw him, he was sitting by the roadside, picking thistles from his feet and gazing hopelessly at his necktie. "He's cured for a while now," chuckled Joe, as the boys came up into the barnyard of the Summers farm. "Cure him? Never!" exclaimed Frank. "He'll be making us all step before the day is out."